Hello? Why is Andorra an independent country? And why is it not only a principality, but a co-principality? That is, with two leaders? And one of the princes is none other than the President of the French Republic. You didn't know? Well, we are going to answer it together. Nowadays, Andorra is a small independent country of Catalan culture, with about 85,000 inhabitants and landlocked in the Pyrenees. Situated between France and Spain, it occupies a territory of 468 square kilometers. As a reminder, the Principality of Monaco, whose history we have already explored, occupies only 2 square kilometers. Incidentally, this makes Andorra larger than Malta or even the Seychelles. However, when you look at a map, you quickly wonder why this small Pyrenean state is not part of either France or Spain. As we will see, the reasons why Andorra is still here today are frankly out of the ordinary. Or perhaps the principality was simply protecting itself with a virtual private network. A virtual private network. You're likely referring to the topic of D-Mystif, history. Though you haven't provided much context, let's get back to the history of the valleys of Andorra. It was during antiquity that the Greek historian Polybius mentioned for the first time in the 2nd century before our era the Andocinoes, one of several Pyrenean valley peoples, later known as the Andocini to the Romans, gave their name to the territory. However, it is in the Middle Ages that the history of modern Andorra really begins, when the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne and then his son Louis the Pious pushed back the Muslim occupants of the region and politically organized the territory by integrating it into the military marches of Spain, a kind of buffer zone between the Muslim territories of Spain and the Frankish Empire. However, the situation there remains complex and in flux. Remember also the mini-documentary about the fascinating and very real story behind the Song of Roland that I shared with you. The link to this video will be available at the end for those interested. It's Charlemagne's grandson, Emperor Charles II, known as the Bald, who stabilizes the situation and entrusts in 843 the valleys of Andorra, in period Latin Valles Andorrae, to a local dynasty. As an integral part of the county of Urgell for precision, the Urgell is the Catalan territory currently displayed on the screen. From the beginning, Andorra's political history spans both sides of the Pyrenees. On the French side, via its Frankish Empire membership, and on the Catalan side through its tie to Urgell County. In 1133, after a process spanning 2 centuries, a politically relevant change will occur for Andorra. The Count of Urgell sells his rights over the valleys of Andorra to the Bishop of Urgell. The valleys therefore pass into the hands of ecclesiastical power, that is to say, in this case, into the hands of the Catholic Church. Later, the Bishop of Urgell aimed to streamline the challenging administration and defense of the Andorran valleys. In fact, a fiefdom, a feudal domain, which he entrusts to a local baron, thus falling under the bishop's authority. This fiefdom, whose leader depends on the Bishop of Urgell, will eventually be controlled by the counts of faith, passing from one thing to another and through inheritance. This began in 1241 when Roger Thorforover inherited his parents' lands. As you can see on the map, part of the sovereignty over the valleys thus passes back to the other side of the Pyrenees. This makes the Bishop of Urgell particularly uncomfortable. The Count of Foix, a powerful medieval lord, faces a struggle for control over his territory. The Bishop of Urgell and the Counts of Foix eventually find a diplomatic solution together, leading on September 8, 1278, to an arbitration granting the Bishops of Urgell and the Counts of Foix full and supreme jurisdiction over the Andorra, in the form of a peerage, that is to say, in more modern terms, a kind of undivided ownership, undivided meaning that there are several equal owners of the same property. In this case, each one is thus princeps, which is a Latin term initially meaning first, and in the medieval context, it's simply a prince, a rather generic term for the time, which was often used to designate a lord. The Bishops of Urgell and the Counts of Faith become the perpetual co-princes of Andorra, which becomes, by linguistic usage, a principality, unlike Monaco, which had explicitly made the move by declaring itself a principality. Thus, both parties have equal authority over the territory, the why and how being specified by a new treaty, 10 years later, in 1288 and 1479, François Phoebus, who is among other things the Count of Foix and Co-Prince of Andorra, inherits the Kingdom of Navarre, which is a small kingdom roughly located in the north of present-day Spain, and of which he becomes the king. About a century later, in 1572, it's a certain Henri de Bourbon who inherits these titles and who is none other than the one who becomes Henri IV, King of France in 1589. From then on, Andorra is carried in the luggage of France's new king, Henri IV, and thus remains both in the hands of the successive kings of France and the bishops of Urgell. And this until the French Revolution. However, a political vacuum sets in once the revolution breaks out. On the French side, the new republican institutions reject the feudal agreement that had bound the French royal dynasty they overthrew to Andorra, and thus the regency court is temporarily no longer assured. This period ends in 1806 when Napoleon I, the Emperor of the French, restores French sovereignty over the valleys of Andorra. This is at the request of the Andorrans, who wish to regain a status that has brought them neutrality and stability before. Emperor Napoleon asked the representatives of Andorra to take an oath, not to him, as was the case with the kings of France, but to the prefect of Ariège. Andorra was attached to the French state rather than a dynasty. The French head of state's co-sovereignty over Andorra's valleys is a legacy of the old regime. That is to say, of the French monarchy, refused by the French Revolution, then restored by the French Empire of Napoleon I, who attaches it to the French state, rather than a feudal system, which has allowed this status to persist to this day? Then a final question arises. Why has Andorra, throughout its history, not been annexed by France or one of the Spanish states? Well, for the good reason that, depending on the context and the era, it's belonging to a French sovereign or a sovereign dependent on one of the Spanish thrones, has protected it from the appetites of one and the other. This is all the more true as its economic and strategic interests are limited, having encouraged neither of the two parties to take the risk of a major conflict for the control of the Andorra valleys, except for Napoleon I, who briefly annexed Catalonia and Andorra before their previous status was restored after the fall of the First French Empire. Andorra will then slowly modernize its political system. In 1866, Andorra's political institutions, directly inherited from the Middle Ages, are modernized in order to allow a larger part of the population to participate in the country's decisions. While in 1933, universal male suffrage was established. Following civil unrest, France sent a gendarmerie force to Andorra to restore public order. 3 years later, the Spanish Civil War broke out, spanning from 1936 to 1939. Andorra managed to escape it, despite several moments of high tension at its borders. This was due to a new deployment of French armed gendarmes, which helped keep the Principality out of the conflict. However, when World War II began, France's military and political collapse in June 1940 could have left a void in the Principality, which lost French protection. Note also that Andorra had not participated in the fighting and was not considered one of the belligerents, just as was the case during the First World War. As a result, Andorra is once again preserved from any occupation due to its nature as a co-principality, linking it to the French state. Collaboration is based in Vichy on the one hand, and General Franco's nationalist Spain on the other hand. When the Germans occupy the territory of the French collaborationist state in 1943, Andorra as a sovereign nation eludes attention for two reasons. Firstly, its valleys lack strategic significance. Andorra's dependence on the authority of the Bishop of Urgell, who is dependent on Franco's nationalist Spain, a potential Nazi Germany ally, is the second issue. After this time, Andorra will see a major population increase. The population of the Principality grew to 8,000 inhabitants after the two world wars, from 37,000 in the early 1980s to around 85,000 today, mainly driven by immigration from the Iberian Peninsula, that is to say Spanish and Portuguese, and of course French, to the point that Andorran nationals now represent only about a third of the inhabitants of the Andorran valleys. During this period, Andorra will also continue modernizing its institutions and political life, leading to the adoption of the very first constitution of Andorra in 1993 approved by the Council of Andorra. The population expressed themselves through a referendum and the co-princes. This constitution gives rise to a political system based on Andorran history and traditions, while modernizing them and adapting them to the modern era. Thus, Andorra is today a parliamentary democracy, managed daily by a democratically elected government in which every citizen has the same rights, while at the same time a co-principality of which, and I quote the Constitution of Andorra, the co-princes are jointly and divisibly the head of state, therefore allowing them to retain powers, such as the convening of elections, the dissolution of parliament, or even the promulgation of laws passed by parliament. The co-princes of the valleys of Andorra are constitutionally the President of the French Republic and the Bishop of Urgell. The country is also a member of the United Nations since 1993, following the adoption of its constitution, as well as the Council of Europe, which is an intergovernmental organization whose primary goal is the promotion of human rights on our continent. Despite adopting the euro, it maintains independence from the EU and is not part of the Schengen area. Finally, we have talked a lot about France today, but do you know when it was established and when it was created? Well, that's what we're going to see now. A big thank you to the channel's patrons, Julien for his great maps, and Océane for her illustrations. Don't forget to also support the channel by checking out today's sponsors NordVPN by clicking on the link in the description or in the pinned comment. We'll be right back for the following mini documentary.